The topic of improvisation. I mean, to some extent, improvisation is takes a place within all arts, and it's always paced between there not being something and there being something, the kind of becoming of something out of nothing. It's associated very much with the musical arts, particularly in Indian music and jazz music, but also a lot of movements have led very strongly on improvisation. Miles Davis, a musician, said that you don't play with what you know, you play with what you don't know. And the great novels, it's not really a novel in itself. It's more like a sort of process of going from passage to passage, not knowing really what the outcome is. But Clarice Lispector said, this flash of instance never ends. My chant of it never ends. I'll finish it deliberately by voluntary act. But it will keep going in constant improvisation, always, always creating the present. That is the future. So this sense of being on the edge of time is what improvisation is predicated upon. So always creating a present, that is the future. Could be a kind of way of understanding improvisation, being on the edge of, being alert to the difference of which the passage of time brings. So the words are intuition, chance, surprise, indeterminacy, invention, becoming, excess, risk. I'll go through those again: intuition, chance, surprise, indeterminacy, invention, becoming, excess, and risk. So it's in between knowing and not knowing, the introduction of indeterminacy over the rule-bound given. So it's that which breaks up the rule. Kant said about genius, genius is that which makes its own rule. And if it makes its own rule, it's bound by indeterminacy over something determined, some method, which is the production of the self-same. It seeks difference. So improvisation, I mean, this is my best attempt to get a one-liner on it. Improvisation is a passage between the unfolding instant and the emptiness. So emptiness is not knowing, a kind of the place where imagination attempts to fill out from the instance, a kind of sense of becoming. So kairos, being on the edge of time, the moment of rupture, the opening of temporality. It's the opening of time in this way, the opening of being is signified. Kairos is connected to poiesis, which is the coming into presence. Poiesis from not being into being, or from absence into presence, a kind of, in such a way whereby something occurs, a truth can happen or occur. And it is located at the interstices of the void and the act of naming. We require such an edge if we need to capture hold of something that is in the air or excessive, in order not to lapse into a reified notion of cultural progression or chronos. So it's on the side of rupture, breaking into time, discovering time for the first time. It's an event of time. There is an edge to the work of art, but in being an edge, it stands apart from emergency. If something is late, then it becomes urgent that time might be found for it, but the work of art never arrives on time, for it cannot determine such things as its arrival, because it is not time in the ordinary sense. In this way, the work of art or the artwork is displaced or thrown out of its immediate sense of time, becoming untimely in the process. So I want to start off with improvisation in Chinese art, and in particular in Chinese porcelain. It was one of the first art forms to experiment with glazes that detach themselves to the control of outcomes. There is a sense within this of being on the edge of time, and with this letting go of final appearance. So this is Tang Dynasty. This is sort of 8th century, 8th, 9th century. This is in Beijing, the a Tang vessel, which experiments with running glazes. So on the level of visuality, it reminds us a little bit of the same effects of running paint or glaze within modernist painting, the post-war years, but is clearly 1200 years in advance of that. So this kind of feeling of spontaneity and letting things occur and letting things just find their shape was within early Chinese culture. So you get the I Ching, the Book of Chants, and in Taoism, you get a great sense of spontaneity and letting things occur in their own time, not forcing things. This is Northern Sung dynasty. This is 10th century, 10th, 11th century. But already this sense of letting pigment run and find its own course and letting pattern emerge from spontaneity. And this is a Sung, Northern Sung teacup. And it's the glaze is produced by oil droplets. So again, it's just an indeterminate outcome, kind of letting the shapes and the patterns occur as if it's like a product of nature rather than a product of design. And tea drinking itself has got that spontaneity to it, sort of meditative ritual. So the teacup is as important as the tea itself, the savoring of the pattern, the shape and the texture plays an important role in the meditation process. Again, Northern Sung. And so there's a never-ending dialectic of testing and making, which opens out the space of improvisation. So enormous amount of these vessels were produced, but only some of them were seen as masterpieces or worthy of imperial collection. But the process is very much through controlling glazes in such a way whereby spontaneity and a sort of natural outcome can occur. And this also was the case within painting. Liang Kai, the immortal, the Southern Song, so it's around the year 1200, so 1,000 years old. Liang introduced what was termed splashed ink style, which was in turn to play an important role in the development of Zen painting in Japan. So he's one of the inaugural painters of a mature Chan Buddhist ascetic, Chan Buddhism becoming Zen in Japan. But it's a sort of use of wet ink and with dry moments, but it's a control of spontaneity. This is the same artist lying in a boat playing a flute by the willow. It's hardly visible. You can just make out eventually the boat. There's hardly any figure-ground relationship. So again, it's something like 1,000 years or more ahead of it's more cerebrally reduced than what you find in even romantic painting of artists like Caspar David Friedrich. So it's this idea of things coming out of emptiness and going back into emptiness. The idea that visible is a mere ripple within the loop of the movement between visibility and invisibility. So it's always on the move. It's always coming in and out of visibility. There's an oscillation, a pulse, a pulsation perhaps of the visible. It's the sort of belief that everything is a product of mind, that nature is in itself an illusion. And so it's this kind of fold of mind and matter that you find in mature painting of the classical period in China. This is a great Japanese painter, the most famous painter, Sessue. It's a landscape from 1495. It's the Muromachi period, I believe. A splash of ink, an awakened mind, a boat passes through and silence pervades space. Mind, space, and matter in a series of folds that open out gestures of emptiness. This is a famous scroll which it's got a very long inscription at the top of the scroll, which was given to his pupil as a sign of his enlightenment. So Sessue made a gesture, he made a painting to acknowledge the pupil's enlightenment, not with words. Sessue was a great walker. He walked the entire length of Japan. He also spent time in China walking from monastery to monastery in the Ming period. He was disappointed in the position of Buddhism within China at that time. He felt it had gone on decline and collected up some paintings and took them back to China and put them back to Japan and vowed to renew the Chan teachings within Japan. And Norman Bryson, the art historian in the Gaze in the Extended Field, writes, the flinging of ink marks the surrender of the fixed form of the image to the global configuration of force that subtends it. Eidos is scattered in the four winds. The image is made to float in the forces which lie outside the frame. It is thrown as one throws the dice. What breaks into the image is the rest of the universe. Everything is outside of the frame. So he clearly sees that this throwing of the ink or the splashed ink style is related to that something which can't be framed, something that can't be captured within perspectival space, that's something which is in a floating relationship to the directions of the universe, the winds of the universe. This is a Zen painting, the Seated Bodhidharma, by Zhuan Enko. This is 18th century. What is figured in this Zen painting is the relationship between the calligraphic statement of not know, so it says not know in the calligraphy, with the seated outline of the Bodhidharma, or Dharma, as it's known in Japan, composed of 3 lines. Emptiness and not knowing do not have an image. Instead, the painting represents this impossibility of representation. So famously, the Bodhidharma went from India to China, and the emperor sought out a meeting with him, and he asks what favors could be bestowed upon him as a devout Buddhist, and Bodhidharma refused to sort of really answer. He just said not knowing or not know, and sat meditated for 10 years in front of a wall in silence. So it's this gesture, this sense of transmission beyond scriptures, beyond word, beyond knowing, that he's established in a way this Zen aesthetic, which is partly a fusion between Indian Buddhism and Chinese Taoism. So Buddhism adapted to the local conditions of Chinese religious thinking or metaphysical thinking or philosophy of nature. Ryokan, a Zen master, lived in the simplest life in a little hut at the foot of the mountain. One evening, a thief visited the hut, only to discover there was nothing to steal. Ryokan returned and caught him. You may have come a long way to visit me, he told the prowler, and you should not return empty-handed. Please take my clothes as a gift. The thief was bewildered. He took the clothes and slunk away. Ryokan sat naked watching the moon. Poor fellow, he mused. I wish I could give him this beautiful moon. We find it's in the 18th century that you get the first explicit experimentations with the equivalent of splashed ink style in Chinese art. Alexander Cozens had some exposure to Chinese painting, but he experimented with blots of ink in order to develop new ways of composing the effects of landscape, opening the imagination to new forms of depiction. So this is one of his blot landscapes. This is before Turner. This is Victor Hugo, the writer, but he did these experiments with stains or taches. This is from 1875, the period of symbolism in French art. But it's the awakening sense of the unconscious at this time in Europe. So it's particularly in symbolism, you find the first conceptions of the unconscious begin to surface itself before Freud introduced the idea of the unconscious as part of the psyche. The term unconscious partly came from Jena Romanticism in the early 19th century. Schelling talked about the unconscious in nature. So already this idea of the nature having an unconscious was in the air in advanced philosophical literature. Gaston Bachelard stated in Air and Dreams, we always think of imagination as a faculty that forms images. On the contrary, it deforms what we perceive. It is above all the faculty that frees us from immediate images and changes them. So with this idea of the imagination comes also the idea of this relationship to the unconscious and the deformation as much as the formation of images. The next chapter is Chance Encounters. We get with again a symbolist writer, Comte de Lautréamont, as beautiful as the chance encounter of the sewing machine and the umbrella on an operating table, which became one of the main predications of surrealism. This idea of a chance encounter of unlike objects. With this, we also get the predication of the found object and collage as a principle. This is Jean Art, the Dadaist. It's untitled Collage with Squares arranged according to the laws of chances in 1917. So throwing down bits of paper and gluing them down it doesn't look very chance-like to me, but I'll take his word for it. And this is a famous photograph by Man Ray of Marcel Duchamp's large glass called The Dust Breeding 2 from 1920. He took this photograph as a document of the large glass. And famously, the large glass was broken, and Duchamp accepted that was the final gesture that the large glass could contain. He glued it together again and was ready for exhibition, but including the breakages. Between 1912 to 1915, Duchamp wrote several musical scores which utilized principles of chance for their performance. Pollock stated that when I'm in my painting, I'm not aware of what I'm doing. It's only when after a sort of get acquainted period that I see what I've been about. He famously, when he started his drip paintings, he famously turned to his wife, Lee Krasner, and said, "What is it?" He he had that sense of not knowing quite what he'd done or what it might be. But there's a kind of sense of the of switching off the cognitive and letting the automatic take its cue or take its role or take its place. So always this idea of improvisation is linked to not knowing the outcome, but not knowing quite what it is as a status, not knowing the name of it. This is a work by Robert Rauschenberg, an early work by Robert Rauschenberg called Monogram. This is from 55 to 59. He would walk around, he was essentially broke. So he'd walk around the street looking for thrown away rubbish and take it back to his studio and see what he could make out of it. He said that if he couldn't find something of interest walking around one block, he'd walk around another block until he found something. It was called by critics, it was gifts, Rauschenberg using the gifts of the street. But there's a sense again of these assemblages of not knowing whether they were painting or sculpture or even something else entirely different, kind of embodying a kind of performance. So they could be theatre props. So it stayed fluid and open. These processes of not knowing what to do next and improvising kept his art on the move. So whereas Pollock incorporated cigarette butts and broken glass and other minor detritus, in part of the employment of broccolage derives from the writing of James Joyce, Rauschenberg started in search of more major forms of refuge from the street. These objects had a utilitarian aspect on the whole, often deriving from interiors such as cupboards, brooms, quilts, umbrellas, clothes, tires, clocks, signs, reproduction of images and newspapers. Rauschenberg talked about gifts of the street. It appears as if anything might enter the domain of these hybrid forms. He said that he always wanted my works, whatever happened in the studio, to look more like what was going on outside the window. The critic Leo Sternberg said that Rauschenberg invented a pictorial surface that let the whole world in. Rauschenberg's picture plane is for the consciousness immersed in the brain of the city. So the sense of the kind of continuity between inside and outside of invention of forms and of letting the everyday into the realm of the art. So it kind of closed the gap between, which was always the dream of Dada, closed the gap between art and life. This is a performance by the French artist Yves Klein, who immersed bodies in blue paint and had a string quartet to accompany the inscription of bodies onto canvas. This is one of the canvases, People Begin to Fly, from 61. He was, of course, very familiar with, he studied judo, the black belt in judo, but he also very, very familiar with Zen techniques of chants. This is Joseph Beuys in his performance, I Like America, America Likes Me, from 74. The story goes that he came to America and was transported to the gallery by an ambulance. And when he'd finished the performance, he was transported back to the plane by ambulance. But this is him locked in the gallery space with coyote dogs. Whether or not this is a Beuys'ian story, which is open to contention. But certainly the performance was documented, and again, this feeling of not knowing what's going to happen, how the dogs are going to behave, and stepping outside of arena of control. This is Andy Warhol's oxidation paintings in 12 parts from 78. He did this, these paintings which were urinating on metallic sheets, playing upon the idea of Pollock's drip paintings, but almost doing a parody of Jack the Dripper with Warhol the Pisser. This is a drawing by Philip Guston. What I've seen and call the picture is what remains in evidence, even as one travels in painting towards a state of unfreedom, where only certain things can happen. Unaccountably, the unknown and free must appear. Again, the alignment with improvisation, the unaccountable unknown, that the free must appear within this unaccountable unknown. This is the English artist John Latham, a 1 second drawing from 1971. I mean, it's more of a concept than an actuality. I mean, how do you know how can you control 1 second? It's more just a spurt of ink. This is the artist Caroline Schoenemann. There's a quote from George Bataille: "Human mind is set up to take no account of chance, except insofar as the calculations that eliminate chance allow you to forget it, not to take it into account. By going as far as possible, reflections on chance strips the world bare of predications in which reason encloses it, like human nakedness, the nakedness of chance, which in the last resource is definite, is obscene and disgusting, in short, divine." As you're literally on a harness and doing a sort of three-dimensional drawing, or a drawing of many dimensions. Again, a kind of relationship to Pollock, but a kind of also a critique of a certain idea of masculinity. Robert Morris, who Schoenemann worked with on some performances, but he did these series of blind drawings from 85. There's a drawing called Blind Time. Again, Joseph Beuys from 74. This is Joseph Beuys on his blackboard drawings. We talk about figuring something out or giving figurative thought. Thus, the figure is something in between not being and being, a becoming that disrupts the rules of representation. But what is Joseph Beuys trying to give figure to? Another experimenter with the ideas of chance and improvisation is Sigmar Polke. This is a work from 86 to 88. Experimented a lot with, he had a big library of alchemical studies. He liked to play around with different materials to almost get psychedelic effects. So he played upon this relationship between indeterminacy and determinacy in a lot of his work, between the given and the invented, between the controlled and the uncontrolled. Spent a lot of his time either drunk or stoned. He went to Afghanistan and got absolutely smashed out of his head whilst he was there and did film record of it. His untitled triptych from 2002. Again, this relationship between the Ben Dot imprint of dots with running paint, and they go from image to abstraction. It's a painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat and Andy Warhol. When they were shown, nothing sold, and it almost led to a fallout between Basquiat and Warhol. And there's a kind of contest between the two of them, each rubbing out what the other had done or negating what the other had done. So it was a kind of meeting of two different, very different minds and very different styles, but meets in the middle, sort of a chaos of willpower. It's on display at the Tate at the moment, Tate Britain. Cornelia Parker called Dark Matter an exploded view from 1991, where she got the army to blow up a hut and recomposed it within the gallery with light at the center, throwing shadows. Saitomble Bacchus in 2006 to 8. Going to do these enormous series of works which had the same palette and often the same canvas size, between 8 and 12 paintings in a series. Here's a great sense of the sort of calligraphic mark. Stepping outside of this, again, return to the idea of the unconscious. For Lacan, the founding truth of the unconscious is the moment it finds or is disclosed to itself. It must found in the forgetting of itself. In effect, there is no direct access of truth for the divided subject constituted within the order of language, because this order is in turn marked by negativity. Lacan divided the subject in 3 orders: the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, in order to understand ways in which the actual registration of the subject alters in regard to situations. Lacan stated that the subject was an agency that introduced division into the individual. Importantly, it is desire that consciousness not only seeks to conceal, but it also signifies the impossibility of a coherent subject. So again, the idea of the improvisation is that the subject is anyway thrown or decentered, has to conceal its own relationship to its desire to know, or to hide the fact that it doesn't know. So there's no direct access to truth. So the way this throwing of the ink, or this is these passages into chance or not knowing, is a way of accommodating a self which is divided in its essence. The famous book On the Road by Jacques Couriac, he wrote on the road in a continuous roll of paper, just freeing himself from syntactical rules of composition. And he said about this book, or within this book, my only witness is the empty sky. This is followed by Naked Lunch. It's an experiment in nonlinear writing that could be entered at any point. Burroughs says desperation is a raw material of drastic change. Only those who can leave behind everything they've ever believed in can hope to escape. Eat lunches, use the fold up and cut up technique. So it destroyed continuous narrative, sort of a nightmare novel, science fiction mixed with experiments in narcotics. This is William Burroughs. So again, in the 1950s, method acting was developed by Lee Strasberg as a way of exploring ways of being true to feelings in order to open up techniques of improvisation. So famously, this is On the Waterfront, where Brando plays a leading role. A lot of the lines were improvised to get into the soul of the character, or portrayal of the truth of feelings. So often Brando is in the film inarticulate and stuttering, trying to find his way in language towards his own reality. He has to make decisions about what's right and what's wrong. He's just guided by a sense of how to find out within this sort of sense of a truth or a direction. So from the outside, the method acting was the means of trying to get to a new reality of American way of life, in this instance, a kind of street life. In '66, the Beatles started to spend long periods of time in the studio in order to experiment with new possibilities of creating sound and music. Avant-garde electronic music, Indian classical music, and pop were combined in different ways to produce new sounds. So what they did in the studio was often played around with tape recorders and passing tape backwards and forwards and mixing up temporalities of sound, and so finding new electronic possibilities of splicing together disparate sounds and different cultures, and sort of a kind of collage technique. It involved also references to things like the Tibetan Book of the Dead and other obvious references to drug culture as well. Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. It is not dying, it is not dying. Lay down all your thoughts, surrender to the void. It is shining, it is shining. Yet you may see the meaning of within. It is being, it is being. This from Tomorrow Never Comes, which I think I've played in the past. So it's experimented with loops of tape played at different speeds to create a soundscape. Here you can see George Harrison playing with the sitar. So it opened them out to forms of improvisation found in Indian music. So the next chapter is live. Live art explores the sensation of being on the edge of time. In Greek cultures, kairos, with an openness towards what will happen next. To be live is to present and then to experience the possibility of the sense of the arrival of what is new. This is a great sitarist, Vilayat Khan, probably the greatest sitarist of the 20th century. Play some of his music afterwards. And again, reference in the 1950s, This is Charlie Parker, developed bebop jazz through the 40s, which was characterized by fast tempo and improvisation. Pollock told his wife that jazz was the only creative thing happening in this country. This is Miles Davis. Don't play with what's there, play with what's not there. And Miles Davis. Intuition differs from mediated knowledge, so that presents what is immediate. Kant describes space and time as pure intuitions because they exist a priori to cognition of the world. Intuition as a faculty possesses a principle of form, and this in turn gives rise to sensible character. In Kant's notion of schematism, there is a presentation of concepts to intuitions in a manner that allows images to discover the relationship to concepts. This is Chuck Berry, one of the great innovators of rock and roll. This is from 56, Roll Over to Beethoven. This is Hendrix, Jimi Hendrix, setting fire to his guitar. This is in a famous concert in the US, where he kind of tried to upstage the Who, who destroyed their instruments on stage. He kind of went a step further and set his guitar on fire with lighter oil. It was in the 66, 67. So Indian classical music, jazz and blues all share a common relationship. They are in part based on the principle of improvisation. Improvisation enables the syntactical structure to be modified, and with this temporal expectancy is discovered in ways that alter the formal limits of what existed previously. So improvisation, another definition between rupture and rapture. The rupture is the sense of it falling into a pit of chaos. Rapture is the ecstatic release that such a risk can bring about. Breakdancing, hip-hop music, DJing all combined to develop new registers of improvisation this was in the 1980s in New York. Gil Scott-Heron, Me and the Devil from 2010. Invention, next chapter. In the spirit of invention, experimentation was the basis of the Black Mountain College. Many collaborators were found there. Merce Cunningham, John Cage, and Robert Rauschenberg worked together both on works, but also philosophical directions. Ideas related to chance, Zen, and indeterminacy opened out new ways of exploring cross-disciplinary practices. They all worked with, at one time or another, Merce Cunningham. This is from 58. Informally, he worked with mixture of Johns, Rauschenberg. He knew of Duchamp, musician John Cage. They used chance techniques in a very innovative way, producing a new form of, he said, there's no thinking involved in my choreography. I don't work through images or ideas, I work through the body. If a dancer dances, which is not the same as having theories about dancing or wishing to dance or trying to dance, everything is there. When I dance, it means this is what I'm doing. So this, again, this sense of being immediately there in the moment, not having a kind of cognitive delay, not having critical distance. There's no thinking involved in my choreography, he states. This is a collaboration with Robert Rauschenberg from '65. Again, with Merce Cunningham, the use of chance operations opened out my way of working. The body tends to be habitual. The use of chance allows us to find new ways to move and to put movements together that would not otherwise been available to us. It is revealed possibilities that were always there, except that my mind hadn't seen them. Again, this way of getting out of habit, breaking habit, using chance techniques or improvisation to do so, having the faith that the body has an innate knowledge of knowing what it wants to do outside of cognitive control, that cognitive control leads to habitual repetition. This is John Cage, who employed chance techniques throughout his ascetic productions. He was a friend of the Zen philosopher or priest Suzuki. John Cage, art is a sort of experimental station in which one tries out living. So again, this preoccupation with closing the gap between art and life. A sort of anti-dogmatic program, a sort of breaking up of rule-bound procedures. So they very much, this group of artists were opposed to Greenbergian formalism. They're connected with, on one side, Dada, but on the other side, Zen, and ideas of indeterminacy and anti-habitual encounter. This is Robert Rauschenberg, Untitled Elemental Sculpture from '53. I call it an experiment in the least condition by which something might gain the status of being a work of art. So I love this piece because it just seems to be a statement of fact, a kind of, you don't question it. You think that the block of wood and the nail belong to one another. Just took the act of getting the hammer and getting the nail and the block of wood and putting it together, letting it be and letting it reside within its own undistinguished materiality. It's almost the kind of image of something pathetic, of something which is pure detritus becoming kind of form of elegance. So Jacques Derrida addresses the subject of invention in the psyche, inventions of the other. Invention implies originality, even if in even illegality. Derrida defines this as something coming out, the coming or the coming about of something new. This linked the notion of invention to the rise of the event that introduced the gap into the customary use of either discourse or inscription processes. So improvisation is coupled very closely with invention. And there's a kind of sense of the illegality or the transgression that borders it. So the coming or the coming about of something new is the definition of invention. It's also going back to poiesis. The idea of poiesis is, it could be said, is the coming or the coming about of something new, as a coming into presence, or the transition between something not being to being. This is Robert Rauschenberg, his performance Pelican, 1963. He got on a pair of roller skates and moved around in a massive open space, the kind of parachute material. This is a work called Gold Standard, which you did as a performance from '69. This is Robert Rauschenberg. He started to experiment a lot with technological interfaces for his work, motorized elements and illuminated elements, and the interactivity of the work relied upon work's reception of sounds of viewers and viewers' environment. Soundings would light up in response to these sounds, creating an immersive interactive environment in the viewer's work. The New York Times, Rauschenberg stated he wanted a work that would be responsive to weather, to people viewing it, to traffic, to noise, to light. This idea of an all-encompassing, this is sort of got an anti-optical gesture to it, sort of switches the ocular with the with sound. Experiments in becoming. This is a short passage about Signals Gallery, which it only existed between 64 and 66. It became the focus of experiments in both kinetic and installation art in London. There was also a journal which explored the crossover of art, technology, science, and philosophy. The director of Signals was the artist David Medalla, who died last year. And associated with Signals was the Brazilian artist Lígia Clark. She said there's no static things, everything is dynamic. So these constructions were meant to be handled, were meant to be reconfigured by the audience. Very valuable, untouchable works of art. Just going back to the definition of kairos, is the instant, the moment of rupture, the opening of temporality. So this is what the sense in which the artists like Lígia Clark were trying to discover, this opening of time within the interaction of people. So she built these devices which would bring the formative principle of looking at each other together. A lot of these works took place or were inaugurated in the context of the occupation of Brazil by the junta or military dictatorship. So you couldn't gather more than 6 people or 10 people together on the street without being arrested. And she developed performances which would transgress that rule. This is Felix Guattari, who worked with in Paris with Deleuze. We cannot live outside our bodies, our friends, some sort of human cluster. At the same time, we're bursting out of this situation. The question which poses itself then is one of the conditions which allow the acceptance of others, the acceptance of a subjective pluralism. It is not only a matter of tolerating another group, another ethnicity, another sex, but also a desire for dissensus, otherness, and difference. Accepting otherness is a question not so much as a right as of desire. Acceptance is a possibility precisely on the condition of assuming the multiplicity within oneself. So, this came later than Signals Gallery, but it touches upon the experiment of signals. Artists like Helio Ortega and Lígia Clark, the performative principle, the David Medalla, when he left Signals, became part of a dance drama group called the Exploding Galaxy. They moved into direct forms of interrelationships between groups and people and expressions. This is the David Medulla sound machine called Lament from '63. It is an exploration of indeterminacy. There's a primitive motor which turned all these elements were drawn from a skip, thrown away detritus. The central column is just an kitchen implement that he covered in sand and glue. But it would make its lonely course around and around and around all the time. Different marks in the sand had a sort of pathos to it. Again, it's exploration of indeterminacy. So to think intuitively is to think in duration. Intelligence starts ordinarily with the immobile, constructs movement as best it can with immobilities in juxtaposition. Intuition starts from movement, posits it, or rather perceives it as reality itself, sees in my immobility only an abstract moment, a snapshot taken by my mind of immobility. Intelligence ordinarily concerns itself with things, meaning that with the static, makes changes an accident which is supposedly superaided. Or intuition is essentially change. As for the thing, as intelligence understands it, it is a cutting which has been made out of the becoming and set out our mind as a substitute for the all. I'll leave it there. It's Henry Bergson, turn of the century again. This is a Cloud Canyon piece by David Medulla. A lot of these experiments don't survive. This is David Medulla at the time of Signals. Medulla studied pre-Socratic philosophy at an early stage of his development, and many of his ideas related to concepts on form, matter that he formed within these fragmentary texts. The idea of mud machines, sand machines, and foam machines was a search for principles which is a source of change at the heart of everything. Rather than serving as models or templates for ideas, these machines open up mediations of the process of becoming. Like Boyce, he was one of the great storytellers and fantasists of that period. Surprise. This is still from Tchaikovsky, Stalker. You dream of one thing and get quite another. The surprise, according to Jean-Luc Nancy, the surprise is nothing but a leap into being. This leap wherein the event and thought are the same. Surprise is not only the connection between thought and being, but also between nothing and something, in which a discourse of being, its truth, and the presence is staged in ways that constitute the event. If the surprise is a leap, then then it is connected to spacings of time, but one which is anterior to all figure, a form of schematism, which is the visibility of nothing as a condition for the possibility of the visibility of something. Again, this way of posing relationship between nothing and something. So the surprise is nothing but the leap into being. This leap wherein the event and thought are the same. The event is the possibility of something new occurring for the first time. This is a photographer, Jado Maruyama, I've shown persistently. So he invariably shoots quickly and without definite sense of composition. He utilizes blur, decentered composition, and visual accidents within the presentation that emphasizes being with the subject. Often he discovers images he had no conscious recollection of. So he's on the street and he doesn't quite control what he's photographing, but when he gets into the dark room, he starts to see things and starts to think, where was that? And such strange facial configuration. Never get that by getting someone to pose for you. So Adorno once described art as a utopian blink, a phrase that should alert us to the difference between ideas of a long duration of history, optical scanning of reality in the blink of our eye, or a redemptive rupture. Much of the language of modernist art has now begun to fade, and even though replaced by critical frameworks, ideas of the avant-garde being ahead of the game, the zeitgeist, historical memory, and cutting edge have lost much of their currency in ways which would make us skeptical about notions such as advanced or contemporary moments. Perhaps this is why there's currency to ideas such as trauma, historical delay or suspension, melancholic discharge, forgetting, archival impulses, disaster, the untimely, spectrality, and rupture. Is this merely the sunset of modernity itself? In all its various manifestations, or are we simply adjusting to a world in which time is always out of joint? Against this, is art merely strategic, a flicker of the present, opportunistic, of the moment, or economic, and as such part of the dominant reality principle? Is the idea of the present, is it that the idea of the present is reduced to being a question mark that predicates itself in the first place? So this is a model of the Louis Vuitton Foundation, an image starting as a point of reference, a proposal, a building which looks like a sailing ship within a park, initial drawing, figuring out what links the image with the model. The drawing is somewhere between nothing and something. This is a sculpture by the Italian artist Enrico David, called Afterbirth from 2013. It's still the idea of the subject is what's pressed under. So it captures this sense of mutation between a chair and a human entity being pressed under by the invitation to sit upon it, be a support for another action. Return again to Felix Guattari, who poses the difference between the idea of the unconscious as a crystallization of the past, or as congealed in its institutional discourse with the unconscious, turns toward the future as scream would be none other than the possible itself. For Guattari, such a difference is born out of thinking, time against the grain, to imagine what came after can modify what came before. In order to explore new and possible interactions on the level of temporality, abstract machines are assembled in order to traverse various levels of reality. In the process of stratifications are both established and demolished in order that casualities might no longer function in a single direction. So this is the kind of rupture of long-standing understanding of temporality as sequence of time past, time present, time future. This is Ray Kukubu from the label Comme des Garçons. This is a costume from 2017. It very much investigates what a chair can be, or what a dress can be, what a body is, what what sitting is. The Japanese designer Izumi Miyake. Now we're in a world where boundaries are being destroyed or redefined before our eyes daily. I feel more people are being left without a sense of definition. A statement from the 80s. It's gained a truth as time has advanced. This is Alexander McQueen, a design for Givenchy from 1997, a mythic and modern fusing late modern spectacle of surprise and luxury. Naomi Campbell, model. It's an album cover for Boy. What history gives us is the possibility of being untimely and placing ourselves outside of constraints and limitations and blinkers of the present. This is what precisely it means to write for a future that the present cannot recognize, to develop, to cultivate the untimely, the out of place, the out of step. This access to the out of step can come only from the past and in a certain way uncomfortableness, a disease in the present. The task is to make elements of this past live again, to be re-energized through their untimely, anachronistic recall of the present. And finally, Deleuze states bringing something incomprehensible into the world, which could be a slogan. It's a sort of not exactly an avant-garde gesture, but a gesture nonetheless towards future that can't be quite defined. So just 4 examples from music. Miles Davis on his last recorded performance. Vilayat Khan, the great sitarist of India. Thai, what's become known as Thai psychedelic music. It's interesting, it's sort of, they turn up for parties and for wedding receptions, and they became an online sort of, it went viral online and became a sort of almost a new form of music, mixing of Himalayan and psychedelic music, Western forms and Southeast Asian music. That last piece was the jazz, sort of jazz, jazz instrument being rendered in terms of an Indian context, drumming, South Indian. Questions or contributions or?
Yeah, hi Jonathan. Maybe I'll kick this off. That I mean, the topic of tonight is improvisation. And I'm just and you talked there of Kant and others, and it's a way to access kind of what's, I'm paraphrasing a bit what's below language and thought. But could you make the argument that all art involves a degree of improvisation? So you think of somebody like Cezanne and the use of color. And I mean, if Cezanne was just painting a landscape, nobody would care, but there's something else that's going on with it.
Cezanne was painting in between the visible and the invisible. And so that involved a kind of intuition of what lay in between.
But does that intuition, is that touching on the similar aspects of improvisation, do you think?
Yeah, he talked about touching the little sensation within, the sensation of nature. And so that could only be accessed intuitively, or I mean, not so much improvisation as intuitive, I think. But you had to find a language, had to discover a language which was an improvisation of form, becoming eventually a manner. So it's that moment where improvised forms become mannerisms or become habitual. And improvisation is a way of keeping alive the intuition.
but in a way that isn't the intuition really kind of where, as you say, the improvisation is going, where Cezanne was going, and other people are doing, and maybe the surrealists tried to get at it in a different way as well.
I think all art would, I mean, just to go back to the original question, I think all art involves improvisation. It involves a gesture which is into the unknown. You don't quite know what you're doing. But then there's a sort of period in which, as I say, it passes into habitual form, and improvisation is necessary to reconstitute the initial impulse. So it's always that difficulty of losing the impulse or struggling to maintain an impulse, which has the principle of vitality and experimentation. So invention, experiment, improvisation, intuition are all words which we use readily to describe art-making processes, but we don't necessarily have a way of differentiating between those different levels. So we often conflate experiment with invention. Or I was trying to define art forms which more explicitly use improvisation as a kind of almost as a content.
But some of the works that you were showing, there's an implied degree of chance, but isn't all chance controlled in some way or another by the artist's intuition?
There's always a contest between it being, I mean, when people reviewed William Burroughs' book Naked Lunch, they said they were dubious about whether or not it was a matter of throwing the dice and fold up and cut up techniques. They said it just read as if it was too controlled to be true. So often there's a rhetoric of improvisation which isn't carried out in reality.
Yeah, thank you.
If there's something you want to look at or play, then we can share the screen. We said last week we'd open out the space for contributions in that way.
Good evening. I'll have a question too. I hope it's not too loud. Is it too loud around or not?
There's noise, but you go ahead.
Okay. So my question has to do with the relevancy of improvisation in today's artistic practice, especially sculpture and, say, painting, and the context of, well, the idea of a concept or an intention or some research-based arts. We have a lot of that being pushed on us. You have to have an idea, you have to illustrate that idea with art. And I think it's not necessarily the way.
We've got to define again the relationship between the cognitive. We have to take the idea of the cognitive and the whether or not art is born out of a cognitive idea or whether it's born out of an abandonment of cognition, whether art is a form of non-knowledge or whether it's a form of knowledge. If it's a form of knowledge, it depends on cognition, your concept or your idea. I think there's been a persistence of this idea of what's your concept as a sort of the starting point within cognition, your idea. I think that's led to a lot of very bad art, one-liners, and so it's a sort of constant strife within art, whether or not there's a cognitive moment as a starting point or whether it's the abandonment of cognition. So I'd say most of the interesting experiments of not just modernity, but let's say modernity, have been with abandoning the cognitive. Often the cognitive is used to tidy up the mess which is left behind from the improvisation or the intuition or So it's a kind of acts as a corrective. But
so they could coexist harmoniously, right? There could be such a thing as automatic drawing with then an analysis, a cognitive analysis of the work that has been done, which isn't definite but offers a way to enter the work.
Yeah, I think we overestimate the power of the cognitive. It's the imperialism of modern society, is the cognitive. The dispute of did he know or didn't he know, was it cognitive or not, is a kind of big big issue within the culture at the moment.
Are there artists currently practicing who work with improvisation within the fields of painting and sculpture and resist that conceptual or intentional cognitive idea of art?
I think most art resists cognition at some level. Otherwise, it wouldn't be art. Product design is slightly different. Product design is a mixture of cognition and improvisation. You need a cognitive element within design. Any more questions? This is just 4 things in chat. Let me just check the chat. Was the hearing wrong? Was the sound wrong?
I have a question.
Yeah, go on.
What's the relationship between chance and randomness? Yeah.
There's the decision to throw the dice, or random is a state of indeterminacy. Chance is a decision to break open form with indeterminacy. So they both have a relationship with indeterminacy, but a different procedure.
So chance is almost like
a decision to
opening up the possibility.
Open out the space of indeterminacy. So there's a cognitive decision to utilize chance, but it's to switch off the cognitive. It's to say throw the elements to the wind, accept. So it reverses the relationship between the artist and the artwork. It gives power back to the artwork. It says the artwork has a knowingness to it that will find form. There's some corrective to the relationship between the ego. It's a sort of attempt to control the ego or the cognitive, which is directed by the ego. It's the disavowal of the will to make art, to plan it, to control it. A lot of contemporary art is a kind of willful, there's giant apparatuses of production, assembly in factories or studios which look like factories with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people, planned production. You don't get much chance within that. You get the reproduction of the self-same. You get you get types of production runs, all looking the same. So early modernity resisted that. become a feature of late modernity, where art is turned into a kind of production of a commodity or a luxury item, or it's mutated into a form of techno-aesthetics. This lecture is indirectly on the minor, the call for attention to the very small or minor, or the incidental or the indeterminate, or
this idea of losing the ego through the act of chance making, or disintegrating one's control, is that, in the realm of art, is that possible? Because
it's a constant experiment, it's a constant strife, it's a constant feature. And we get all kinds of instructions to do otherwise, or we get asked what our concept is, or what our idea is, or what we're about. So we're asked to introduce a kind of corrective to the ego in terms of idea. So idea being purity or definition or boundedness. So it kind of is linked to naming. We incline to overname things. And that gives us a sense of will and a sense of power and a sense of conquest.
How does that feature in this moment of such focus on identity, especially in the realm of art?
We overemphasize the role of the subject in all its manifestation. So we want to know what the script is, want to know what the narrative is. So you've got to have a story. But that is part of the will to art. So the will to art becomes subsumed under identity.
It's like the snake chasing its tail.
Yeah, well, that's what I assume. But we need a story. I mean, that was introduced by particularly Joseph Beuys, who said all humans are artists, all subjects are artists. And some artists have better stories than others. And his story started off with his crash as a Stuka pilot in the German Second World War, and being saved by the Tartars and wrapped in felt and fat. So he gave a narrative, gave a story that was a miraculous story, it was in fact an impossible story. You'd have died of exposure. It wouldn't have lasted more than a few minutes. Would have been found half dead, half alive in the snow, in the ice, in those conditions. Would have died of exposure. But it was a good story, and it was reproduced endlessly. People almost introduced him with that story.
It's mythological.
So it's used in a myth, for better or for worse. But we tend to like those stories, those narratives, because it becomes the content for the work.
But then that also concretizes the individual or the artist. So
it's to do with the tension between the artwork and the individual, whether or not the artwork is beyond authorship or not. I assume in some way that the work of art is beyond authorship because it exists after the death of the artist. We tend to lose all those stories. and tend not to be too concerned about the moral rectitude of the artists involved. I mean, if we made the sorts of judgments we make of subjects now, we would abandon most artists to the ruin of history because they were in some way incorrect.
Complicated.
Hmm?
Can I just go back to the cognitive for a minute?
Yeah.
Because I don't quite understand it, because I can't get how you can sort of switch off the cognitive or experiment with switching off the cognitive without losing consciousness.
When you meditate, you switch off the cognitive.
Okay.
The thoughts are as common as grass, and that's Patanjali, who was the philosopher of yoga, Indian philosopher of yoga in the ancient period. His thoughts are as common as grass, and the point is with meditation is to switch off this busyness of the mind and let the mind just be in time, unhindered by reflection. That's a sort of...
Sorry, that's assuming that the mind is somehow different or separate from you. Yeah, you are the mind.
But the cognition is a particular registration of to be conscious. It plans, it wills, it produces, it makes decisions.
If I can quickly add to that, in a deep state of meditation, one does lose his consciousness. You do lose your own awareness. And so while self-awareness is indeed a faculty of cognition, this can be shut down in meditation.
I mean, when we listen to music, if we get absorbed within music, we attend to the sound. Miles Davis said that he used to walk around the stage often with his back to the audience. He said, they pay to hear me, not to see me. But he was he walked around the stage because he was sensitive to the sonic, in different spaces, the sonic resonance was different. So he walked around to find the sonic resonance he was seeking to create. That was an amazing piece of film where he plays the riff, kind of gets into what the riff would be, and he transmits it to two musicians and lets them sort of take it away. So it acts as a sort of transmitter of sound. The sound current is taken up and then taken somewhere else, and he goes into the background. So he plays with gestalt, the foreground and background, and starts off in foreground and becomes background. And intuition is a tool for making that transition, that spatial transition, that perceptual transition. But it's perceptual, it's not cognitive. He doesn't go on the stage thinking, I'll move around to this place and that place. He doesn't plan it out, he feels it out. Vilayat Khan, when he's playing, he is on the edge of a note which goes into silence and comes back into silence. That's not cognitive. You can't do it cognitively. It's not sophisticated enough to get that sound current. cognition is a very small part of what our perceptual organization in relationship to reality is. It's only so many bytes, so it's only bits of information, very small bits of information. So we overestimate the cognitive in terms of the information that we are sort of managing at any given time. Seeing is takes an incredible amount of bits of information. Cognition is a reducing valve. If we had the sensation of all the bits of information that we're taking in at any given time, we'd go crazy, we'd be overwhelmed. So cognition is a reduction valve which enables us to censor. So we limit information through cognition. So rather than it being an expansive valve that gives us insight, it reduces insight. That's how drugs work. Drugs work to release the faculty of seeing within registers which we have pre-censored.
What's your advice or methods for, I mean, other than drugs and meditation, for working through, you know, when you've been doing a lot of writing and a lot of reading and a lot of cognitive work, how to get out of that space whilst,
well, when I write, I don't use cognition that much.
So then do you go back to have to do the referencing and things like that?
Cognition would be too clumsy. So when I paint, I lose it. I lose time. I lose. Just let it go. Let it go where it wants to go.
I mean, with, you know, creative, I mean, yeah, it seems more obvious with artistic practices, but with writing, to create that space, I mean, just because I'm writing dissertation right now, how much one's mind is filling as you're writing, and then how actually that becomes almost like this distancing from the act of being able to write.
Cognition helps you with models and with formulas, and it doesn't help you with releasing the energies that would take you into a place where you've not been before.
Yeah.
Cognition is limited. It tells you what you know. It doesn't introduce you into what you might find out or what you might come to know. So it's attached, that is attached to risk. So you're on the edge of not getting it, but that transition between knowing and not knowing is what intuition or what improvisation allows you to make that transition. And it opens out the relationship between there being nothing and there being something. And if you write or you paint or you make, with that oscillation or that echo chamber or that potentiality, you get a result which is a new form. Cognition is hopeless for I mean, that's why a lot of people have their best ideas when they wake up, before they wake up. When they're half asleep, half awake, they get the idea. Often things work, you know, the artwork often works because it's asignifying. So we listen to music, we think we know what it's saying, but what it's actually saying is maybe quite dumb in terms of the cognitive content, the narrative content, but the combination of sounds and gestures and moods and mistakes and is what makes something have potency. So it's sort of accidents. detritus very often, what shouldn't occur, coming to the forefront. So it reverses the gestalt. So what's usually in forefront is pushed to the background, and what's background comes to the foreground, and we get a kind of resonance of a new reality out of that. If everything's fixed by cognition, we don't move. We produce a model of what we already know, which is all right. We need habit. Nature relies upon habit, but without invention and without improvisation, nothing develops, nothing evolves. So history of the world is the strife between habit forming and improvisation, of adaptation. We don't adapt without improvisation. I guess that's why we become artists. We're sidestepping ordinary cognitive behavior or cognitively based behavior, instrumental behavior. Why we tend not to believe in general in instrumental investment in things, means to an end and outcomes, and they tend to be a little bit chaotic or wholly chaotic. We believe in eureka moments. We get very frustrated. Nothing happens for a long period of time. Suddenly, the moment comes along where we get it. It could be a kick on the shin that does it. So it's also attached to a kind of minor form of violence. We have to put up with discharge of, and it works between, as I say, rupture and rapture. Rapture is an ecstasy, and rupture is a the hole in the beneath us. But all I'm saying is we need a forum, a sense of a forum where we discuss and work out what experiment is for us, what invention is for us, what improvisation is for us, what cognition is for us, and what form is for us, and what beauty is for us, and so forth. So that's a cognitive task. But in order to get to those things, we have to loosen up and free our minds from rigid definitions. You have to brush it off. Does that satisfy you?
Yes.
And there's a sense in which you're working with absorption. You relax into things. You lose yourself into things. You become your experiment. Or you become your own experiment. That this for this week. Next week is the Flex of the Marvelous, which is my closing gambit for this year. I've sort of moved out of the, I mean, it's still the same form. It's a PowerPoint, but it's got a slightly different